when we follow a pattern for a project worked in the round, somewhere at the very beginning the pattern tells us to join stitches for working in the round, and it rarely tells us how to do it. In this video I'll show you 5 ways. Before we get started looking at each of the ways, there is a very important thing to keep in mind. Before we start joining stitches, it is super important, it is crucial to make sure the stitches are not twisted. So to do that, place the needles in a circle, so that it doesn't matter what kind of needles you use. I use the magic loop, you may use the double pointed needle, so one circular, it doesn't really matter. Just arrange stitches in a circle so that it's kind of a circle, and make sure that the ridge at the bottom of the cast on edge is inside that circle. So if something is outside like this, fix it right now, because otherwise you won't be able to fix it later on, a few rounds down the road. That's it, you will just have to unravel the work and redo it, and that's not something we're looking forward to, right? So now that we have this little thing settled, because that's, I repeat, that's very, very important. It's one of the few knitting mistakes that cannot be fixed without unraveling the work. So that's something that we really need to think about. And now that we know that, let's move on to the way number 1. The first one is the easiest. We don't actually do any special tricks to join the stitches, we simply start working in the round. But before we do that, it's important to arrange the stitches in such a way that the yarn, the working yarn, comes from the right. So it is attached to the group of stitches on the right needle, like this, like I have right here. If you plan to use the marker to mark the beginning of the round, then place it on the right needle right now. I often don't use a marker because I go by the tail, so whenever the tail is, that means the beginning of the round. But in many cases it's much easier to use a marker, so if you do plan to use it, then place it on the right needle. If the first stitch, according to your pattern, is a knit stitch, then bring the yarn to the back. If it's a purl, then bring the yarn to the front. So for me it's gonna be just a simple knit, and I'm gonna knit it. That's what I'm gonna do. Like I said, there is nothing special about this way. Once you make the first stitch, pull the working yarn a bit to close the gap, because you will have the gap because there is no join, there is nothing there, right? It just, we started knitting, that's it. So pull the yarn a bit to close the gap and then continue knitting. Just like this. And when you do, as you work round after round after round, you will notice, I'm going to show you a swatch that I made, you will notice that this way of joining stitches creates a step. It's not really kind of a gap, it's more like a step, because we start knitting in a spiral. And again, it's not the end of the world, but if you want to fix it, you can easily do it when you weave in the tail. So you basically take the needle. My tail is a bit short, but you'll get the idea just how to do it. So thread it into a wool needle, and then see, I use the long tail cast on, and it has those slants to the right. So I'm gonna weave the tail in the same manner. I'm just gonna move it to the back of the work so that it slants to the right, like this, and pull it tight. So this way it's kind of fixed. I mean, it looks nice, right? It looks really nice. And then I would hide the tail the usual way I do, and that would be it. So I'm gonna just do it quickly right here so you see the finished edge. And that's how it looks. The second way is the one that I usually use when I work in the round. I don't really know why I like it so much, but it just, I guess it's just a matter of habit, because it's not easier, it's not better in any way than other ways, it's just what I'm used to. So here's how this way works. Cast on the number of stitches that you need for the project, so no extra stitches here, just the number that the pattern tells you to cast on. And then, same as we did in the previous way, arrange the stitches so that the yarn comes from the right, just like this. See, and make sure, of course, that the stitches are not twisted. That's super important. Now slip the first stitch on the left needle. That's going to be the first stitch that you cast on. Slip it to the right needle like this. And then insert the tip of the left needle into the second stitch on the right needle. That's going to be the last stitch that you cast on. Insert it and pass this stitch over the other one like this. Don't drop stitches. We are not reducing the number of stitches, we are simply crossing these two stitches. If you plan to use a stitch marker, now is a good time to put it on the right needle, just like this. And then you start knitting, start working in the round. If the first stitch is a knit, then you keep the yarn at the back. If the first stitch is a purl, then you bring it to the front. Just as your pattern tells you, whether to knit or purl a stitch. For me, it's going to be a knit stitch, so I'm going to be just knitting it. And once you knit the first stitch, then pull the yarn, the working yarn and the tail, depending on the cast on that you use, to tighten the stitch and close if there is any gap between stitches, which there shouldn't be. But if it happens, then you pull the yarn and tighten it all, and then continue working in the round. And once you do, here's another swatch that I made, and that's how this way of joining stitches looks. Here is the place. I kept the tail to tell you what the join was. So, and otherwise it looks pretty seamless. It looks nice, and there is no jog, no step here, because we crossed the stitches and they all create now a nice even line. So that's the second way of joining stitches for working in the round. The third way is very similar to the previous one, but with one big difference. We are not gonna just pass the stitches one over the other. We're gonna bind off one stitch right here, right at the cast on edge, which is a bit funny, right? So, and to do that, because we're gonna bind off one stitch, we need to cast on an extra stitch. So in this, if you plan to use this way, then cast on one extra stitch. For example, if the pattern tells you to cast on 50 stitches, then you cast on 51. And that's it. And now arrange the stitches in the circle. The yarn comes from the right, same way as we already did, and move the yarn to the back of the work. Now we do the same. We slip the stitch from the left needle to the right needle, just like this, and that's going to be the first stitch that you cast on. And then we insert the tip of the left needle into the second stitch on the right needle. With this, that's going to be the last stitch that we cast on. Pass it over the first, just like we did in the second way, but now you drop it, you let it go like this, and you pull the yarn to tighten the gap. If you plan to use a marker, then place it on the right needle, and that's going to be the beginning of the round for you, and work the first stitch. Again, if it's a knit, you keep the yarn at the back. If it's a purl, you bring the yarn to the front, and then keep knitting. Keep knitting because we already tightened the gap. If you feel that it's loose, then pull the yarn tail again to completely eliminate the stitch that we bound off. So it's going to be just keeping the stitches together without being present almost. So it's going to be really, really small. And then keep working in the round. And once you do, here's how it looks at the end. The place of join is right here, as you can tell by the tail. And it's also even, it's nice, it doesn't have any gaps, any steps, any jogs, nothing at all. And because we pulled the yarn so tight to close to basically tighten the stitch, the one that was bound off, there are no holes, so you don't see that there was an extra stitch somewhere here. To join stitches for working in the round using the way number 4, we will also need an extra stitch. But this time we're not going to need it for binding it off, we're going to need it for working 2 stitches together. And that means we cast on 1 stitch more than the number of stitches the pattern tells us to cast on. We arrange the stitches same way in the circle, the yarn is at the right. And now about the working yarn. If the first stitch, according to your pattern, is a knit stitch, then keep the yarn at the back. If it's a purl, then bring it to the front right now. Mine is going to be a knit, so I'm going to keep it at the back. Slip the stitch from the right needle. Now it's not the left needle, now it's the right needle. slip the stitch from the right needle to the left needle. So it's going to be the last stitch that we cast on, and we move it to the left needle. If you plan to use a stitch marker, then place it on the right needle, just like this. And then, depending on the pattern, knit or purl 2 stitches together. So I'm gonna knit 2 stitches together. We are knitting the first stitch that we cast on together with the last stitch that we cast on, just like this. And then stop and pull the yarn to tighten the stitch. And continue knitting. That's it. Knitting or purling, working in your pattern. Just like this. Your stitches are joined. Now let's see how it looks in the swatch. So once we work a few rounds, that's what we see. The join is quite seamless. The only thing that you need to keep in mind, because we're working 2 stitches together, if the yarn is quite thick, then it's gonna show as a little bump. Not the end of the world, not a big deal really, but just keep in mind that if you're using a thick chunky yarn, then you would probably feel that extra stitch knit together with the other stitch. You would probably feel it as a little bump, but it's gonna be really tiny. Otherwise, it's a really nice way to join stitches, and that was the way number 4. The 5th way of joining stitches for working in the round is a bit different than the previous 4 ways. First of all, it doesn't work for all types of cast on. It only works for the types of cast on that leave a tail hanging with the first stitch. So for the previous 4 ways, I used long tail cast on, and that one has the tail and the working yarn together at the same side when you cast on, right? But that won't work for this way of joining stitches, because it needs to have a piece of yarn attached to each side of the stitches that you want to join. So that's very important. But the good thing, we don't pay any attention to the working yarn. It doesn't matter whether it's on the right side or left side, so whichever way you have it, it is good. So as long as you have 2 pieces of yarn attached, one at each side of the stitches, that's when you can use this way of joining stitches for working in the round. If you prefer to use a marker, if you plan to use it, then you can place it on the right needle right away before we join anything, and then you align the working yarn and the tail like this. Just keep them together, double strand them basically, and work the first stitch whatever it should be. If it's a knit, then keep the yarn at the back and knit it. If it's a purl, bring the yarn to the front. And to work the first stitch, use both strands, the working yarn and the tail, use them together just for 1 stitch. Oh, and I split the yarn here, so I'm gonna do it again. Okay, now it's better. Let go of the stitch. Now stop. Let go of the yarn tail. We don't need it anymore. We used it only for 1 stitch, and then continue working in the round. If you feel that the stitch is too loose, especially once you finish 1 or 2 rounds, you will see that it's a bit loopy. In this case, you simply pull the tail, and then you get a nice even join, and that's how it's gonna look. I'm gonna show you another swatch. That's how it looks. See, it's really nice. You don't really see where it is, the seam. The line is all flat, straight, and no gaps, no nothing here. But same as it was true for the previous way, because we are using 2 strands of yarn to make the first stitch, if the yarn is super chunky, you might feel a bit of bulkiness here in just this very tiny spot, which is basically not a big deal. Otherwise, a really great way to join stitches for working in the round, and that was way number 5. Here they are, 5 ways to join stitches for working in the round. The link to the step-by-step instructions is in the description. Take time to try all of them to find the one that feels most comfortable to you. Thank you for watching this video and have a wonderful week. I'll see you next Thursday.